A prayer for those trapped in financial anxiety, Part 1. Liberation begins here. Like and subscribe. If you've ever felt weighed down by money stress, you're not alone, and healing starts now. Every morning, Mason woke up to the same ache in his chest, a silent, invisible pressure that squeezed tighter with each sunrise. Bills on the kitchen table, missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, rent past due. He didn't remember exactly when the anxiety began, but he knew it now, lived with him like a shadow. It crept into everything: his smile, his sleep, his sense of self-worth. Some days, even brushing his teeth felt like a luxury he couldn't afford to care about. And the worst part, he kept it all to himself. Mason wasn't lazy. He worked hard to part-time jobs, freelancing when he could, even selling old books online. But the numbers never added up. Life was just ... expensive. Every paycheck evaporated before he could exhale. No savings, no safety net. Just a loop of survival. Friends invited him out, and he said no. Not because he didn't want to see them, but because his card might decline. He avoided eye contact at work, afraid someone might ask how he was really doing. The answer? I'm drowning, but no one can see it. That night, Mason sat alone in his small apartment, lights off, laptop closed, phone face down. The first time in a long while, he said something out loud. God, I don't know if you're listening, but I'm scared. He wasn't sure if it was a prayer or a cry or both. But as he spoke, something shifted, not outside, but within. The silence felt different, like someone might be listening. Maybe not to fix everything instantly, but to remind him, you don't have to carry this alone. The next morning, Mason's neighbor, Mrs. Elena, cheerful widow in her 70s, knocked on his door with a plate of banana bread. You looked tired yesterday, sweetheart. Thought you could use a little sweetness? He almost cried, not from the gift itself, but from the feeling that someone noticed. They chatted for a while, and she mentioned her church's weekly group. We talk, pray, cry, laugh, ... You'd like it? Mason didn't believe in churches, not really, but he believed in hope, and hope was getting harder to find. That Friday, Mason went to the group. Just to listen, no expectations. And what he heard shocked him. A woman shared how she overcame bankruptcy. Father confessed he'd pawned his wedding ring. A student admitted she couldn't afford meals, yet they smiled. They prayed. They believed, not in money, but in peace. A kind of peace Mason hadn't felt in years. One of the group leaders handed Mason a small card at the end. On it were the words, Lord, help me find peace in the storm, and trust that you will provide even when the numbers don't make sense. That night, Mason read the card 5 times. He didn't feel peace yet, but he felt possible. That was more than enough. He wrote his own version in a notebook. I may not know how to fix this yet, but I believe there's more to life than fear. I believe I can breathe again. I believe in help. I believe in you. He didn't fall asleep anxious that night. For once, he simply slept. If this story touched your heart, like and subscribe for the next part in Mason S.'s journey, from survival mode to a life of joy, stability, and trust. Because financial anxiety doesn't get to write your ending. Part 2. Finding faith amidst chaos, Mason woke up. Saturday morning without the usual dread in his chest, but it wasn't gone entirely. The rent was still unpaid. His phone still buzzed with payment reminders. The prayer group had been a breath of fresh air, but doubts began to creep back in. What if this is just emotional distraction? What if faith is just false hope? He sat at his kitchen table, staring at a cracked coffee mug, wondering if anything had really changed. Deep down, he wanted to believe something had, but believing wasn't easy. At the next prayer group, Mason arrived early and found a seat near the back. This time, he listened more carefully. A man named Jalen, mid-40s and dressed like he'd just finished a long shift, shared his story. He'd once lived in his car, using gas station sinks to stay clean. I didn't start praying because I was religious, Jalen said. I started praying because I had nothing else left to try. And somehow, God showed up. Jalen's words landed in Mason's heart like a whisper. You, Dante, need to have it all together to talk to God. Later that evening, Mason walked home with his hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets. Streets around him buzzing with nightlife he couldn't afford. Felt torn. Part of him wanted to lean into faith, while the other part still clung to logic. to numbers, to control. What if faith makes me complacent? What if prayer is just pretending? The thoughts came in waves. But beneath the surface, a deeper voice whispered, what if peace doesn't come from having control, but from surrendering what you can't? Mason decided to test it. Not a big commitment, just 5 minutes a day. He'd sit quietly, no distractions, and talk to God like he was writing a letter. He spoke out loud about the bills, the fear, the shame he carried silently. And when he ran out of words, he'd sit in stillness. No fireworks, no angels, just quiet. But day by day, he noticed something. The chaos in his mind got a little quieter. His shoulders relaxed. He started breathing deeper. Prayer didn't change the numbers, but it changed him. That week, Mason began to notice things he hadn't seen in a long time. A child laughing on the train. The smell of fresh bread from a bakery he walked past every day. The color of the sky at sunset. He wasn't rich, not by a long shot, but the richness of living began to return. He realized that financial anxiety had blinded him to beauty. Now, with each prayer, it felt like God was handing his sight back. The world hadn't changed. Mason's vision had. Sunday morning, Mason called his younger sister, Chloe. She had offered him help before, but he'd always declined. This time he just wanted to talk. I've been struggling, he admitted, voice shaking. Not just with money, with everything. Chloe was silent for a moment, then softly replied, I've been praying for you. Mason closed his eyes and exhaled. For the first time in years, he felt connected, not just to his family, but to something bigger than himself, something holy. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to believe. Part 3. The Path to Financial Clarity. The following Monday, Mason sat on the floor with a notepad, a calculator, and a pile of unopened envelopes. It was time to face the numbers. He had been avoiding this for months, maybe longer. Prayer had done something unexpected. It gave him courage. Not magical answers, not instant solutions, but strength. With each envelope he opened, he whispered, God, give me clarity. Bill after bill, Mason wrote it all down. Rent, credit card debt, student loan balance. It was overwhelming, but seeing it clearly was oddly empowering. He finally knew what he was up against. By the end of the hour, Mason had a full financial snapshot. The total was painful, almost $18,000 in debt. But now it wasn't a dark cloud. It was a battle plan. He taped a sticky note above his desk that read, I cannot fix everything today, but I can be faithful today. That night, he looked for part-time gigs online and watched a YouTube video on budgeting. He didn't fully understand compound interest or snowball repayments yet, but he was learning, and learning gave him hope. Mason decided to start small. Canceled 2 subscriptions he wasn't using. Brought coffee from home instead of stopping at the cafe. He set up a free budgeting app to track his spending. Each step felt like a pebble, but the emotional weight began to lift. Instead of reacting in panic, he was responding with intention. Prayer had calmed his spirit. Now discipline was strengthening his steps, though he still made mistakes like forgetting to budget for a coworker's birthday lunch. He stopped beating himself up. Progress, not perfection. One night after work, Mason caught himself smiling while scrubbing his bathroom sink. It wasn't because he loved cleaning, it was because he no longer felt paralyzed. Anxiety had made life feel like an emergency. Now, there was still pressure, but not panic. In prayer, he'd begun to see himself the way God saw him, not as a failure, but as a fighter, a survivor, a student of grace. Financial clarity, he realized, wasn't just about math. It was about identity. He wasn't broke, he was becoming. Inspired by the prayer group's advice, Mason started journaling. At the top of the first page, he wrote, God, show me what to do with what I have. Then he listed every resource, not just money, but skills, contacts, side gigs, talents. He realized he was good with words. Maybe freelance writing could bring in extra income. He remembered his friend who ran a small business. Maybe he needed help with social media. Mason wrote down 1 idea per day. Not all would work, but the act of writing reminded him, you are not powerless. That Friday, Mason paid the electric bill on time. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a jackpot moment. But he lit a candle, said a prayer of thanks, and whispered to himself, you did it. The anxiety wasn't gone, but it was losing its grip. For the first time, financial clarity didn't feel like shame. It felt like dignity. And dignity, Mason discovered, is a prayer lived out in daily choices. Part 4. Embracing abundance mindset. For most of his adult life, Mason had lived with a deep sense of lack, not just financially, but emotionally. Even when he had enough, it never felt like enough. There was always fear. What if it runs out? What if I lose my job? What if something breaks down? Scarcity had become the lens through which he saw the world. His prayers helped calm the anxiety, but now he noticed another layer, the belief that he would never have more than just enough to survive. And that belief, he realized, was quietly shaping every decision he made. During the next prayer group, the theme was abundance. At first, Mason rolled his eyes. He'd seen enough prosperity preachers on TV selling miracles for donations. But the leader, an older woman named Grace, shared something different. Abundance doesn't always mean more money, she said. It means seeing the plenty you already have. It's seeing every meal, every breath, every relationship as a gift. When you live from that place, you stop fearing lack. And fear is the real poverty. Mason sat still, her words ringing in his chest. Here is the real poverty. The next morning, Mason walked to work and decided to look for signs of abundance. Not cash, not cars, just moments of fullness. A bus driver smiling and waving, tree heavy with blossoms, a toddler dancing to street music. He took a picture of a note taped to a coffee shop window. Free cup for anyone having a hard day. Abundance, he realized, was everywhere. He just wasn't used to seeing it. Gratitude wasn't about denying hardship. It was about balancing the scales, reminding himself of what remained when life tried to convince him he had nothing. Mason began speaking out loud when he caught himself thinking negatively. I'll never get ahead. No, I'm learning how to move forward. Everything's too expensive. No, I'm prioritizing what matters most. Started posting sticky notes on his bathroom mirror. I am enough. I am provided for. God is not limited by my bank account. It felt cheesy at first, but over time, the new language took root. His mind began to shift, not magically, not instantly, but steadily like a wound closing. One Sunday, a man stood outside the prayer group hall with a sign that said, "Hungry, anything helps." Mason hesitated. He didn't have much himself, but he remembered something Grace had said. Generosity breaks the grip of fear. So Mason gave the man half of his sandwich and offered a silent prayer. God, multiply what's left. That afternoon, Mason got an unexpected text from a freelance client he hadn't heard from in weeks, offering a new project. It wasn't about karma, it was about alignment. When Mason lived like he had something to give, life responded in kind. That night, Mason wrote a new prayer in his journal. God, open my eyes to abundance. Help me notice your gifts small and great. Let me see what I have, not what I lack. Teach me to give freely, live fully, and trust deeply. I release the fear of not enough, and I embrace the peace of knowing you are always more than enough. He closed his journal, smiled, and whispered, I'm already rich. Just in ways I didn't know how to measure before. Part 5. Community and support networks. Mason used to think asking for help made him weak. He'd grown up in a household where strength meant silence and independence was worn like armor. Even when things got tight, he'd say, I'll figure it out. But lately, his quiet strength had begun to feel more like quiet suffering. One night after the prayer group, Mason watched the others talking, laughing, exchanging numbers, praying for one another. He realized healing doesn't always come in solitude. Sometimes it comes through someone else's voice, reminding you that you're not alone. That week, Mason did something brave. He texted Jalen, the man from group who'd once lived in his car. Would you be open to coffee sometime? I have some questions about how you made it through. Jalen replied within the hour. Absolutely, brother. That's why I show up, to give back what I got. They met at a quiet cafe, and Mason brought his journal and a long list of questions. But what he got wasn't just financial tips, it was connection. Jalen didn't give polished advice, he gave his story, and that made all the difference. Over time, Mason found himself sharing more with others, his struggles, his small wins, even his relapses into anxiety. And what surprised him most was how people responded, not with judgment, but with relief. I thought I was the only one, they'd say. One coworker confessed she was drowning in credit card debt. Another admitted he hadn't told his wife he lost hours at work. The more Mason shared, the more others opened up. And what formed was an invisible web of quiet strength, a network not built on wealth, but honesty. One day, Mason's bike chain snapped on the way to work. He sat on the curb, frustrated, already doing the math in his head about repairs. Just then, Mrs. Allen Eath, the sweet neighbor with the banana bread, drove by and stopped. "You hop in?" No arguments. On the ride, she talked about a local community pantry that also offered free budgeting classes. "They help my grandson," she said, smiling. Mason had never even heard of the place. One connection opened the door to another. Help was everywhere. He just never let it in before. At the next prayer group, Mason volunteered to lead the closing prayer. His voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each word. "God, thank you for placing people around us, even when we feel invisible. Thank you for reminding us that you often show up in someone else's kindness. Help us be humble enough to ask and brave enough to receive." When he finished, a young woman came up and said, "I needed to hear that." It hit him then. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was contributing. He was part of something. That night, Mason started a group text with 3 people from the prayer circle. Weekly check-in, just to support each other. Everyone replied within minutes. Yes, it wasn't a grand network or a fancy mastermind. It was just people checking on each other, sharing their highs and lows, praying, encouraging, celebrating tiny wins. And slowly, Mason understood, community isn't a luxury, it's a lifeline. In a world that worships independence, asking for help is rebellion, and receiving it is healing. Part 6. Overcoming financial setbacks. Just as things began to feel steady, the storm returned. Mason opened an envelope one Tuesday morning. His electricity provider had backdated an error from 3 months ago. A $280 unexpected charge. His stomach twisted. That was nearly half his rent. For a brief moment, the old Mason resurfaced. Panic, blame, shame. The feeling of drowning came back stronger than ever. "God," he whispered. "I thought I was finally getting it together." Sat on the edge of his bed in silence, the old lies banging on the door. "You're still behind. You're failing again." This time, something was different. Mason didn't spiral. He breathed. He closed his eyes. He remembered his tools. Pause. Pray. Plan. He pulled out his journal, flipped to the page titled Emergency Mindset Tools, and read the words he'd once written. "Setbacks are setups for wisdom. You've made it through worse." He called Jalen. "Got a minute always," Jalen said. They met for coffee, and Jalen just listened. No judgment. Then he smiled and said, "So, what's your next move?" It was exactly what Mason needed, not pity empowerment. With renewed clarity, Mason called the electric company. He was nervous, but respectful. "I just need a payment plan," he said. "I'm trying to do the right thing." To his surprise, the customer rep was kind. "We've seen worse," she laughed. "We can split it over 3 months. No interest." Mason almost cried. That S, when it hit him. So much of life's weight comes from fear of confrontation, but facing the problem almost always hurts less than hiding from it. God wasn't removing all problems. He was making Mason strong enough to face them. That week, Mason went back to his spending tracker. He found room to shave off $20 here, $10 there. No more takeout for a while. He sold an old microphone online for extra cash. It wasn't glamorous, but it was movement. The setback became a springboard not just for financial correction, but for deeper trust in his ability to adapt. Every choice, every prayer, was like a brick in the road he was building. And now, even setbacks had purpose. At the next group meeting, Mason shared his story. He didn't talk like a victim, he spoke like someone becoming whole. "I used to see setbacks as proof that I was cursed," he said. "Now I see them as invitations. Invitations to rise, to rethink, to rely on God in new ways." Heads nodded around the circle. Some eyes welled up. Someone whispered, "I needed that." For the first time, Mason realized that resilience isn't about bouncing back. It's about building forward. Every moment of struggle was giving him more strength than he had ever known. Mason paid the first installment on his electric bill and celebrated with something smaller sunset walk. His favorite music in his earbuds, and a whispered prayer. Thank you, God, for every challenge that didn't break me. Thank you for showing me I can bend without shattering. I still get scared, but I am not the same man I was. I've seen what's inside me, and you are there too. He looked up at the sky, painted in orange and violet, and thought, even this storm was sacred. Part 7. Discovering Inner Strength One Quiet Morning. Mason sat on his balcony with a cup of black coffee and asked himself a question he had avoided for years. Who am I really? For so long he had measured his worth by numbers: what he earned, what he owed, what he couldn't afford. But lately, through the waves of prayer, progress, and support, something deeper had emerged. Beneath the noise of financial chaos was a person with grit, with kindness, with faith. He whispered, God, help me see myself the way you see me. And for once, he didn't feel ashamed to ask. Mason looked in the mirror not to check his hair or appearance, but to see, to face himself. And it startled him. He looked tired, yes, but stronger too. His eyes didn't hold the same despair. His shoulders were more squared. There was still uncertainty in his life, but it wasn't his identity anymore. I am more than my bank account, he said aloud. I am more than my past mistakes. Saying it didn't instantly erase his doubts, but it cracked something open. A sense of dignity that had been buried beneath years of silent struggle. That week, Grace from the prayer group gave Mason a scripture card that read, You are fearfully and wonderfully made. Psalm 139-14, he taped it to his fridge. Every time he opened the door, he'd see it. It became a small ritual read. The verse, breathe deeply, whisper thanks. In time, he began to write affirmations in his journal. I am resilient. I carry wisdom from my wounds. I am a vessel of peace, not panic. I'm allowed to take up space in this world. Prayer wasn't just about asking for help anymore. It was about agreeing with truth. Still, the voice in his head didn't go quietly. On harder days, it said things like, you'll never catch up. You'll always be behind. But now Mason responded, that's not the voice of God. That's fear. He began recognizing the difference between conviction and condemnation. Conviction pulled him forward. Condemnation pushed him down. One led to change, the other to shame. And slowly, he stopped entertaining voices that didn't come from love. He stopped letting financial pressure narrate his story. He started reclaiming his inner dialogue. Mason found himself smiling more at strangers, at dogs on the street, even at his reflection. His strength didn't come from grand achievements. It came from keeping promises to himself, just making that call, showing up on time, saying no to impulse spending, saying yes to help. Each act became a small rebellion against the lie that he was weak. Strength, he wrote in his journal, is getting up even when you're unsure, and showing up even when you're scared. And every time he prayed, he felt the roots go deeper. Not in money, but in identity. That night, Mason wrote a new prayer before bed. God, thank you for revealing who I am, not what I've lost, not what I owe, but who I am. When the world tells me I am lacking, remind me I am full of your spirit. When fear rises, anchor me in peace. May I no longer seek validation from numbers or praise, but from your voice within me. Let strength rise from my soul like a steady fire, and let that fire light the way for others still trapped in silence. And with that, he slept like a man at peace with his reflection. Part 8. Financial wisdom and planning ahead for months, Mason had lived in what he called financial emergency mode. Everything was about getting through the next day, the next bill, the next crisis. But as peace grew inside him, he began asking a new question. What if I could plan instead of panic? Not just for this week, but for next month, next year, even a future he couldn't fully imagine yet. Financial survival had taught him discipline. But now he felt something deeper, rising vision. The belief that he could build something, not just endure something. Mason signed up for a free budgeting and finance workshop at the community center. The room was full of everyday people like him, teachers, single parents, students, retirees. The facilitator, a retired banker turned volunteer. said something that stuck with him. Most people aren't bad with money. They've just never been taught how to use it with intention. That hit Mason hard. No one had taught him. He wasn't broken, he was just uninformed, and learning was something he could do. He took notes like a student discovering a secret language. Back at home, Mason created a simple spreadsheet. Income, essentials, minimum payments, sinking funds. He made categories: groceries, rent, transport, emergency, dreams. He gave every dollar a name. At first it was awkward, but by the third week it felt empowering. He wasn't guessing anymore, he was guiding his money. One of the most powerful parts, adding a generosity line. Even if it was $5, that little gesture reminded him, I have enough to bless someone else. That mindset transformed budgeting from a chore into a spiritual rhythm. Next came the dreams. Mason wrote them in a list: no shame, no limits. Pay off credit cards by next year, save $1,000 for emergencies. Start a side business with his writing. Take Chloe, his sister, to dinner to thank her. Travel to the mountains just once to breathe different air. These weren't just goals, they were prayers in progress. Every line on that list was a sign that Mason believed in a future worth planning for. Financial wisdom wasn't about hoarding, it was about hoping. The prayer group, Mason shared what he was learning. Planning used to feel like a punishment, but now it feels like preparation, like I'm making room for God's blessing. Grace nodded and said, wisdom builds the house, prayer paints the walls, and peace fills the rooms. Everyone chuckled at the metaphor, but it sank deep. Mason realized that spiritual maturity included stewardship, not fear-based control, but trust-based action. He wasn't just praying for provision anymore, he was partnering with it. That night, Mason knelt beside his bed, not in desperation, but in alignment. God, thank you for giving me the mind to plan and the heart to dream. Teach me to steward what I have with wisdom and to believe you are invested in my growth. Let me not fear the future, but prepare for it with faith. Show me how to multiply what's in my hands and to live with a heart full of purpose, not pressure. I surrender my need to control, and I embrace the gift of responsibility. And in that prayer, Mason didn't just see his life changing, he saw himself leading it. Part 9. Cultivating lasting peace. It started with a flat tire, then a delayed payment from one of Mason's freelance clients. Then, unexpectedly, a letter arrived with a medical bill from months ago that insurance hadn't fully covered. One by one, the challenges came rolling back in, not huge disasters, but enough to stir that old familiar feeling: panic. Mason sat in silence on the edge of his bed, clutching the paper. The work he'd done, the growth he'd experienced, now felt fragile again. For a moment he wondered if peace had only been temporary. But then, like a light breaking through fog, Mason remembered something Pastor Lee had once said: peace isn't something you wait for, it's something you practice. He took a deep breath, placed the bill on his desk, and whispered aloud, I've been here before, but I'm not the same person. Instead of spiraling, he opened his journal. He turned to his emergency fund page, $630 saved so far, enough to cover the tire and still have a little left. It wasn't a miracle, but it was movement. And movement toward peace was victory. Mason realized that peace wasn't built in emergencies. It was built in rhythms. Daily prayer, weekly planning, monthly check-ins. He started each morning with 5 minutes of gratitude, no matter how much was due. Every Sunday, he reviewed his budget like a spiritual practice, asking God, how can I align better this week? And when anxious thoughts returned, he didn't shove them down. He named them, prayed over them, and responded with action. His routines weren't perfect, but they were anchors. And anchors keep you steady when storms return. One Saturday, Mason did something bold. He took a day off. No budgeting, no hustling, no problem solving. Just a walk in the park, a cheap iced coffee, a visit to the library, and laughter with Chloe over takeout. It wasn't lazy, it was holy. He remembered how God himself rested after creating the world. If rest was part of divine rhythm, then surely it should be part of his life too. That night, Mason wrote in his journal, Rest reminds me I'm more than my balance sheet. I am loved even when I'm not producing. It wasn't that problems stopped coming. It was that Mason stopped giving them full control. When an unexpected bill came, he no longer saw it as a monster. He saw it as a challenge with an answer. He stopped catastrophizing. If he couldn't fix something in a day, he broke it into parts and handled what he could. And each time he chose calm over chaos, prayer over panic, planning over guessing peace grew stronger. Not louder, just steadier, like a quiet current under his feet. One night, Mason stood at his window, looking out at the city lights, and he whispered a new kind of prayer. God, I thank you that peace isn't just a gift, it's a path. Thank you for showing me that chaos doesn't have to rule me, and anxiety doesn't have to trap me. I trust you with the days ahead. Strengthen my spirit to choose calm, teach me to rest when I'm tired, and remind me daily that I am not alone. Let peace be more than a feeling. Let it be my foundation. And in that moment, he didn't just feel better, he felt free. Part 10. From Anxiety to Assignment. 6 months after the lowest point in Mason's life, he stood in front of a small group at the local community center. It was a financial wellness night hosted by the church, and he had been invited to speak. He wasn't a financial expert or motivational speaker, just someone who had walked through anxiety and come out the other side. As he shared his story, the panic attacks, the overdue bills, the moments of breakthrough, he saw nods, tears, and most importantly, hope. His pain, once private and paralyzing, was now purposeful. Mason remembered when he had nothing but fear. Now he had tools, wisdom, and a story that mattered. Created a simple guide called the Peace Plan, a one-page list with daily habits, budgeting basics, and prayers for anxious days. He handed it out freely, no catch. Even started a blog where he wrote about financial recovery from a faith-centered view, titled Grace Over Guilt, Money with Mercy. Every comment he received felt like a hug from heaven. Thank you. I thought I was the only one. After one of his workshops, Chloe found him in the hallway and wrapped him in a tight hug. You were born for this, she whispered, and Mason believed her. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had survived the questions. He had walked through financial fire and found not only healing but calling. One evening, while journaling, he wrote, God, thank you for not wasting my suffering. What once shamed me now strengthens others. He knew he wasn't done healing, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He was walking on mission. His account balance still had limits. Rent still had to be paid, but Mason no longer equated peace with a perfect paycheck. He measured his life in clarity, connection, and calm. And so, in the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by his journal, his Bible, and a few sticky notes with verses on the wall, Mason whispered a final prayer, not a desperate cry, but a declaration. Lord, thank you for walking with me through the darkest financial valley. You taught me to breathe in chaos, to plan in faith, to rest without guilt, and to give even when I felt empty. Help me keep walking this path, not just for me, but for every soul who's drowning in worry. Use my life to remind them, peace is possible, and you are enough. Mason's story is not fiction, it's yours. Maybe the names are different. The numbers in your account may still keep you up at night, but hear this, you are not your debt, you are not your balance, you are not what you've lost. You are a child of God, walking toward healing. This world will try to chain you to fear, but grace always breaks the lock. So today, breathe, take the next step, say a prayer, and believe. Freedom isn't far. You were never meant to walk alone. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who feels overwhelmed today. Let's build a world where no one fights financial anxiety in silence. A prayer for those trapped in financial anxiety is more than a story, it's a starting point. Your journey matters, and the best is yet to come.